Patience. Bert's still working for Kmart. Following his adventure in the woods, Alex Spaghetti found himself slightly ostracized by the other members of the community. His report of the Gloofers' actions, his own meeting with the Gloofers' apparent owners, and their tale of lunar immigration had all been met with skepticism. Work on his house, so close to completion, had ceased. "Only one thing can redeem you," McCabbage told Alec. "You must get the members of your club to join us." "Don't you believe me?" Alec begged McCabbage. "Alec, it isn't a question of belief." McCabbage ran his hands over the surface of the Barsoomian globe in his study. "We are an organization devoted to the realization of the ideals of our favorite fictional franchises without the attendant necessary falsehoods perpetuated by those franchises. You know what I mean, the incompatibility of human life forms with other planetary environments due to differences in gravity, atmosphere, and microbial content, the inconsistencies of artificial gravity in a so-called starship. These are things that we must set aside conceptually if we are to make our dreams come true." Eventually, after the initial punishment phase was over, Alec was sent out to make his plea to the members of the Federal Nextdoor Association. He hadn't been home in a long time. It took him a while to make contact with everyone and find out what they had been doing. "A lot of people just gave up on the whole thing," Loomer Applegag told him over the phone. "The core of the group, though, the nucleus, we've stayed together, meeting on a rotating basis in different houses. That guy I introduced to you at our last meeting, Vibermar Aesop, he's kind of taken over." "Really?" Alec replied. He felt lost. "Well, tell everyone I've got a surprise for them." 10 people, including Alec and Aesop, met the following Saturday in Alec's basement. "It means giving up your lives here," Alec explained. "I know that's difficult, but I've done it. I'm making arrangements to sell this house and take up full-time residence in the community." He showed them his squirrel costume and photographs of the secret valley as evidence of his claims. In the end, only Rose Gal, Don Cartertable and his family, and Vibermar Aesop agreed to accompany Alec back to the community. "But of course we'll be taking the club name and all your wonderful collection with us," Aesop commented, standing there in his beautiful vintage costume. Alec bit his tongue. From his viewpoint, Aesop had never been formally inducted into the club and was not officially a member. But with so few members agreeing to join him, he felt it best to say nothing. Back at the community, his return was greeted tepidly. "Your club had 36 members at its height," McCabbage complained, fists on his hips like a bald, white Lando Calrissian. 37, Aesop corrected. Alex stammered helplessly. He was hot, tired, hungry, and he had to pee. He let his bundle of supplies drop to the ground. "Pick that up," McCabbage ordered. At that moment, the end of a rope ladder struck him in the face. "Climb aboard!" a booming voice commanded from above. Everyone looked up. It was Clark Seville in the basket of a hot air balloon. "You! Alex Spaghetti!" he called again. "Climb up!" Alec looked about him and complied. "Stop him!" Thalaris ordered the community members looking on. Seville pulled Alec into the basket with one hand, while with the other he pelted the pursuers with rounds from a potato gun. A look of exultation and triumph was on his face. "Clark!" Alec cried once they were over the mountain heading east. "Where'd you get the balloon? And thanks, by the way." "You're welcome. I stole it from the suggestible trapezoid headquarters." You did?" Alec looked at Seville in amazement. Clark Seville smiled broadly. "I no longer work for the organization," he said simply. Back in the community, Vibermar Aesop informed Rusty McCabbage that if they needed an expert on the two-headed boxer, they need look no further. Dr. Krobish. Block and Mercedes had called in Dr. Krobish after discovering Hith strapped down on a board in the front yard with a length of cable running from inside his rectum out into the surrounding field. "So this is the animal you've been telling me about," Dr. Krobish remarked as he approached Hith, medical bag in hand. "He won't let us help him," Mercedes whined. "He won't tell us what's going on," Block added. "Won't tell you? Oh, that's right, he's supposed to talk." Dr. Krobish chuckled. Pet owners. It was a mistake to treat an animal as one of the family. It hurt all the more. It only hurt all the more when they died. He should know. He had 2 parakeets. Krobish bent to examine the strange dog. "You don't know how he came to be in this situation?" he asked. "No, Dr. Krobish," answered Mercedes. "We just came home and found him like this." "This is a clear case of animal cruelty. The police will have to be notified." Yes, but isn't there anything you can do for him?" Bach pleaded. Well, I can begin by trying to remove this cable somebody rammed up his backside, Krobush replied, opening his bag. Oh, Buck, Mercedes turned to her husband. This is so wrong. There's something about this whole situation. I just know things weren't supposed to turn out like this. Buck tried to comfort his wife, but he really didn't understand what she meant. He looked around the yard as he held her, trying to avoid looking at the veterinarian and his patient. 30 feet from the dog stood an inflatable snowman left over from the Weihnachten Juli. 30 feet from the dog stood an inflatable snowman left over from the Weihnachten Juli party they had last weekend. 30 feet from the snowman was a giant tire that one of the farmers working the fields had left the day before, intending to come back and get it later. And 30 feet from the tire, one came back to the dog. In fact, now that Buck thought about it, the three things formed an equilateral triangle. Okay, here we go, Dr. Krobush announced, taking a firm hold on the cable. Too late, Hith said in his gruff voice. What's that? Krobush sounded flabbergasted. You see, he talks, Buck told him. I don't think this is the way it was supposed to happen, Mercedes repeated, her nagging contention. Before Krobush could recover his wits enough to yank out the cable, the explosive mechanism which comprised the bulk of Hith's innards detonated. I was never anything more than a walking bomb, were the dog's last thoughts. The explosion's power was far beyond the relative size of its source, for it worked in tandem with the nature of the very universe itself to destroy everything for miles and miles around. Buck and Mercedes' house, the sorghum fields, the woods, the mountains, the city of Wapshok Falls, the far distant town of Wankins, and all the intervening tunnels and literary passageways that connected them were utterly obliterated, leaving only a hazy off-white zone where not even the moon could provide some reference point for up or down, top or bottom, beginning or ending. Yet even as everything ceased to be, time functioned strangely, perhaps due to the unique workings of the bomb, giving Bach and Mercedes and Dr. Krobush the opportunity to complete their thoughts and comments of these events. I never would have believed it, Krobush declared, his voice sounding much like that of Charlton Heston in the high school locker room. A talking dog. He just showed up one day, Buck mentioned the fact as if idly answering questions coming from some game show on TV. All of this should have happened at night. Mercedes sounded intent on getting at the heart of the matter. It would have been more dramatic. You and your drama, Buck sneeringly replied, even as his voice seemed to fall away across the ocean of time. I'll have to remember that, Dr. Krobush spoke only to himself. A talking dog. Flemsat. The zone of whiteness gradually became black at the edges until we had something approximating normal space. Floating at a safe distance away from the area of the destruction was a roughly cylindrical construction which contained accommodations for hundreds of observers. High up on its uppermost level was a large window behind which stood two people, Jerry Lancaster and I. Why'd you decide to call this station the Flemsat? Jerry asked me. It's named after Ian Fleming, the first major author I got interested in. He's a major author, is he? Compared to Louise Fitzhugh or Franklin W. Dixon, yeah. What about Ben Bove? Didn't you read two of the Exiles books as a child? Very good, Jerry. Yes, I did, but I didn't really pay any attention to the author of those books. Ah. We stood in the window for a long time, watching the immense hazy blob of white slowly dissipate, becoming a vast black field. Jerry drinking a liquefied form of ethereal paste, and I a bottle of chilled green tea. Well, that's that, I said. Now what will you do? Paint. Paint with a vengeance. Jealousy and revenge. That's right. I finished the bottle and dumped it into space through some sort of dumping mechanism. Are you pleased with your work? I won't know for some time yet. I'm happy that it's done. I'm proud that I did what I said I was going to do. But I'm disappointed that it wasn't exactly what I really wanted to write. What did you want to write, exactly? I'm not sure, exactly. Something crazier, but at the same time more unified. I don't know, a real novel. Something like Confessions of Zeno, or To the Lighthouse, or On the Road. Flemsat had extensive painting facilities. It was a relief to get away from the agonizing struggle of writing for a while in paint. Here, too, however, I faced the difficulty of doing what I really wanted. Partly the difficulty lies in knowing what I really want to do. Obviously, my tastes run to the weird, but how will that weirdness be expressed? How much allowance should I make for the potential consumer of my art, whether that art be painting or writing or whatever? I did a large painting entitled Wide Cage Corset Thinly Stamped with Almonds that showed a man painting a picture of a large larva-like lady from some other planet creating a piece of visual art by technologically advanced means. Her image was indecipherable within the limits of our cultural boundaries, but it seemed to be a large, red, octopus-like sky god emerging from a gilt-edged window in the atmosphere, puking up a pestilence of insectoids upon an army of tennis-playing apples. The man painting the scene was being distracted by the arrival of his extended family, each member of which was carrying some memento of his religious upbringing. His longing to escape, which was mirrored in the lava lady's own thoughts, was shown in a thought balloon containing a picture of the man as a child digging a hole under a table in a darkened Sunday school classroom, while his bald-headed pastor squatted outside, urging him to pull his hair out and chop the rest of his penis off. Nobody is ever going to want to hang that over his bed, Jerry let me know when he saw the finished work. I don't give a shit, I replied. I did what I wanted to do, and that's the only thing that will matter when I'm lying in my deathbed. It might matter whether that deathbed is paid for, Jerry joked. It was a joke, for the idea that I would ever make a living off any of my artistic pursuits was most laughable. You know, I'd like to see what you would do in the field of writing if you did what you really wanted to do, Jerry continued as we made preparations to scuttle the ship. So would I, I agreed. But I think in order to do that, I would have to assume some sort of proxy. What Toadskabode would like to write. He checks the spatula in time for ghosts. The cracker sandwiches were filled with the sharp, powdery cheese product. The same kind of cheese filling in cheese waffies? Very similar, but not quite as sharp or powdery. The television, although as modern in its capabilities as any commercially available, was housed in a large ornate wooden box. Don and Phil joked that it looked more like a piece of furniture. They settled down before it with their cheese crackers, their homemade Rice Krispie treats, and their steaming mugs of green tea. It reminds me of the TV at my grandma's house, Don said. Both grandma and house are long gone, thought Phil, as the swarms of night insects signaled the arrival of Molech, Meor, and the others. Systematic gravestones, nutritional compounds, functional wooden boxes of hand-carved ornamentation containing supposedly magical supplies. They are the ghosts, explained Howie, a master of introductions, but I have been supplanted in your imagination by the tiny animated dinosaur that drags the credits into view. It seems I am not colorful enough, not cute enough. Hands rolled in the dark, broadcast innards, and fingers pointed to outstretched watches. Moloch and Meor now gathered around the mammal gland. It dispensed white plastic triangular mouthpieces with which the two ghosts fitted into place. These mouthpieces extended past the lips and covered the end of the nose. Some of the other ghosts joked that Moloch and Meor looked like star hogs, for the flat ends of the mouthpieces were covered with star-like hooks or fangs, as suitable for Halloween as rooting up linoleum. As these jokes continued to the feebler response of the studio audience, the mammal gland slowly bounced and pulsed under its own power. It was shaped like a beanbag chair on the down pulse and like a fig on the up pulse. The entirety of its surface was covered with fine, fur-like crimson tendrils that curlicued in distant patterns. The mammal gland's nipple was hidden in a thick gathering of these tendrils, such that any product, such as the mouthpieces, had to be coaxed out by artificial means, including industrial pumps and the threat of grinder gears. The former was handled by small, subservient ghosts in this particular scene, and others mortal slaves did the work. In later episodes, the mammal gland became a traffic analyst at a TV station in a large southern metropolis. These episodes, however, were avoided by Don and Phil. Although they were but newly introduced to the program, they had already developed a bias in favor of the groundbreaking first season. In the UK, Phil commented as he took a bite of a raggedly cut cube of Rice Krispie treat, they refer to such groupings of episodes as series, not seasons. Yes, I am aware of this, Don made his rejoinder. He had waited until his mug of green tea was exactly the correct temperature to drink. That is, just cool enough to gulp down without burning himself. He liked it hot, but not too hot. A good name for a film about two men in the early 1980s pretending to be gay might be Some Like It Not So Hot. Don had went through a 4-year phase in which he refused to consume anything containing caffeine. He recently begun drinking green tea, however, as he felt the need for some gentle self-medication. There were those, Phil among them, who suspected that Don had started on the green tea because of the influence of James Purdy. This was not true. Although Don had found Purdy strangely compelling at first, he quickly abandoned him after subsequent delvings into the writer's work were deemed not weird enough. Do you mean unsettling? Niggers think Lysol is a deodorizer, when actually it is only a disinfectant. It was Meor who made this observation. Moloch, who feared being overheard in conversation with someone who freely used the word niggers, smiled in response and looked carefully around. He needn't have worried. With their mouthpieces in place, the ghost's speech was rendered virtually unintelligible. Fortunately for Don and Phil, Gazprom the dinosaur dragged subtitles onto the screen. This sort of thing wouldn't be allowed today, Don noted. Tell me, Phil insisted, when you say weird, do you actually mean unsettling? In the context of James Purdy, I do mean weird, because whereas the work is unsettling, it isn't actually weird. I don't look for the unsettling necessarily in literature, but the weird, for lack of a better term for it. Moloch and Meor and the rest of their entourage loaded the mammal gland onto a cracker and moved south, parting the afro with a rude ravina. Next week, within the context of Wings and as an ingredient in the classic Wings sound, I like Linda McCartney's backing vocals, but that was tomorrow. Not caused by any ketchup on this earth. Dmitry Basiliscus worked for a manufacturer of plastic pellets in compost, New Sweden. The pellets were manufactured by the Groping family, were acclaimed as some of the very best in the world. Whereas most pallets are intended for loads of no more than 2,000 pounds, ours have been field tested with loads of up to 3,000 pounds, boasted Hudson Groping to a tiny room full of cocktail party guests. In addition, they have an estimated term of use of 10 years and 8 months. The gestation period of the giraffe whale, thought Barry. Compared to 8 to 9 in the case of our competitors. And one more thing, young Groping quickly added, seeing his audience subtly checking the tiny room for alternate means of egress. A Groping pallet is a full 26 square inches bigger in surface area than the national average. What do you think about that, eh? All of these extras and advantages naturally made the Groping family pallets more expensive than other manufacturers. Thus, it was far more imperative to the company that they get them back after they had been used. As explained in a recent BBC documentary on the subject, many people hold on to pallets after taking delivery of the items shipped on them. Of course, most of those who do this do so in order to send them back out again with other goods or equipment on them. But some people turn the pallets to inventive uses, such as planters for herbs or temporary walkways. Members of the deputy cult turn them over and use them as teaching tools, seeing in them models of the deputized universe, dominated by the 9 mountains of defuncture. Hence the bright green sticker on the side of each Groping pallet, informing the public the Groping Pallet Company will pick up any of their pallets that may have been left in one's possession. All one need do is call the toll-free number and tell their friendly agent where to pick up the pallets. This is where Dmitry Basiliscus enters the story proper. It was his job to drive around District 5, comprising the southeastern region of New Sweden and the adjoining lower half of Gubertronica, picking up his employer's property as directed. One day, in late June, Dmitry was sent to J&L Coffee Snots in the town of Plover, high in the Grunter Plateau. You know, technically this isn't my district, he told Evelyn, the woman who handled all the paperwork and phone calls. Dmitry was tall, 37 years old, with a burgeoning John Wayne belly. He stood beside Evelyn's desk, holding the pickup order in his hand and wearing bone-white coveralls scuffed here and there with charcoal patches of gray. Oh, yes, it is, Evelyn retorted. She pulled out a map of Plover and showed Dmitry how the J&L Coffee Snots building was on one side of Softsack Road and on the other is the beginning of District 6. But for a couple of yards, and this would be Omar's problem, Dmitry shook his head wearily. It's a nice long ride, Evelyn admitted. Give you a chance to listen to your Death Defender CDs. Death Defender? Dmitry repeated incredulously. Do you mean Death Angel? Whatever. Evelyn closed her eyes dismissively. It's all that devil music. Dmitry moved to the door, about to take his leave. Death Defender, he said again, incensed at the musical ignorance and indifference on display. Out on the road, Dmitry did indeed listen to his music, only it wasn't Death Angel but Fuss, and it wasn't in CD format but MP3. I'm driving a company vehicle, he reflected for our benefit. No CD player, so I have to listen to headphones. That's against the law, he could hear his mother say. I've never been much on obeying the law for the sake of obeying the law, he thought. That, he added in anticipation of his mother's own thoughts, is exactly why I got this job, why I'm reduced to this kind of job, why I'm such a loser as to have this kind of job. My own ignorance and indifference, he concluded philosophically, although that may be my author's license making him more aware than he really is, making him aware of his hypocritical interconnectivity. It was indeed a long ride, or drive, depending on your insistence on such bogus distinctions. Dmitri made it through 4 albums of music during the trip. The albums were They Broke My Crackers by Erstwhile Robot, Rant's Corruptibles by Princess Nose, Outer Goat by Press and Affliction, and Afro Souffle by Solomon's Kong. See, thought Dmitri as he put away his MP3 player in preparation of leaving the vehicle, I don't just listen to devil's music. Those bands may be pagan in outlook, but they're not necessarily satanic. He was parked in the main lot of J&L Coffee Snots. If there was a loading dock, Dmitri couldn't see it. He was prepared to take on board up to 840 pallets. He had a pallet jack and a hydraulic lift built into the back of the truck to facilitate the transfer. Pickup order in hand, he entered the front door of the building. The office was blandly furnished. However, Dmitri had no eyes for the framed print of an anonymous barn hanging over the miserable chairs in the lobby. He immediately recognized the woman at the receptionist's desk and couldn't stop staring at her. "Karen," he said in amazement. "Dmitri!" The woman came from around the desk and embraced him. "What are you doing here?" they both demanded simultaneously. "I'm here to pick up a pallet," Dmitri explained, holding out his paperwork. "Well, there it is," Karen replied, pointing to a single pallet leaning against a wall next to the copier. "So you work here?" "I know, isn't it awful?" "No, I didn't mean it that way. I mean, look at me." Dmitri gestured at his shabby uniform. It even had his name embroidered on an oval patch over his left breast pocket. "So you drove all the way here from where?" "Compost." "From Compost to pick up a pallet?" "Hey, that's fine with me. Sometimes I have to pick up so many I have to make 2 trips. This wasn't exactly true. He'd only had to do that once. "How long have you been doing this?" Dmitri thought about it. "About 3 years. Going to be 3 years soon." "What about you? How long have you been here?" "A year." Karen wanted to add more, something of a derogatory nature apparently, but she kept her thoughts to herself as now some of the other people who worked in the office were moving closer, intrigued by this curious reunion. "Everybody, this is Dmitri Basiliscus. Dmitri was my high school boyfriend." "Is that right? We haven't seen each other in 20 years. 18, Dmitri corrected her. After a couple of introductions, the other workers went back to their tasks, leaving Dmitri and Karen to complete their chat alone. "You still married to, Andy?" Karen laughed. "No, we got divorced 7 years ago." "What about you? Did you ever get married?" "God, no," Dmitri answered. "I think I'm temperamentally suited to bachelorhood." Karen smiled. "And you smiled too, didn't you, when your sister accused you of lying about the theft of your mother's pain medication? She has a little method that she uses, one that she thinks is absolutely foolproof, one she thinks she learned from your father to determine if someone is lying to her. She assumes they are lying in the first place, and then says, 'I know you're lying. I know you're lying,' in a cutesy, simpering tone, 'because I can see that smile. I can see that smile,' and grins herself as she baits you, teases you, tempts you to return the smile, for then, by smiling back, you have confirmed that you are a liar." Karen invited Dmitri to lunch as it was just about that hour, but Dmitri politely declined. He loaded up his single pallet and climbed back into the truck. He chose to listen to Gordon's Cinema Leg Leaf by Psychological Birds. The last unhappy person in the world. It is a mistake to assume that the digital singularity will totally engulf every single damn person on the planet. Obviously, there will always be some people obstinate enough, suspicious enough, primitive enough to refuse every last bit of technological benefit that they are entitled to. In keeping with the avowed principles of the one world mind/government, these people will be mostly left alone. The dichotomy of sane/insane will no longer be accepted, but everyone will sort of accept the non-participants as the harmlessly mentally ill. However, as one of the touted advantages to being permanently linked to the ultimate technology is final and ultimate happiness, the continued existence of some unhappiness in the world will be a great motivation for the one-minders to interfere in the lives of the outsiders. One such outsider lived in a cave in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. His name was Tad Mushy, not that names mean anything anymore. The collective we was sufficient. "We have brought you these inducements," they said on crawling down into the cave. They came in a myriad of guises, 1,000 Jesus Christs, 12 sanitized Hitlers, spiders, snakes, and frogs, and a walking tree. They crowded around Tad Mushy, who was folded up on some ancient artifact of unknown utility. Their gifts were symbolic, of course, representatives of all that life could be. Tad Mushy stopped up his ears and closed his eyes. Little good it did. Their voices traveled along all wavelengths, not just sound. They spoke to his brain whether he willed it or not. "We won't make you do anything you don't want to do," they said, "but tell us this at least. Why are you unhappy?" "I'm not unhappy," Tad Mushy finally screamed. "I'm scared." Airwaves, coconut pills, identity curled. A group of 4 men take a boat trip on the so-called easiest day of the year and find a mass of buttons and turnips floating in the middle of the ocean. Determining which day is the easiest was easy. Someone put a finger on one of those office wall calendars that show all of the months at once. This person kept putting down fingers until a day appeared that no one had any objections to. No astrologers or biofeedback experts were used. The hard part was deciding what to call this day, what quality it was to embody. The friendliest day of the year, the day of optimum sexuality, the day we all speak too many words. "Come on, fellas," groaned the Mel Gibson clone. "It's the easiest day of the year. We've already established that." "We've also already established that we go on a boat trip and find a mass of buttons and turnips floating in the middle of the ocean," Ray retorted. "So why bother taking the trip at all?" There was much nodding of heads over this point, so much so that a consensus was quickly arrived at. "We will not go on the boat trip," they all agreed. Even those among the 4 men who were not the 4 men. They each carried with them a host of tiny beings dependent on the host body by little wires, Drechen, steamed dumplings, and long hats. These last were the kinds of hats a man could hide his arms in. Mel hid his arms in one as the 4 men set out on their alternate activity, visiting the great circus exhibition. "Let me explain," Walston later told somebody making a documentary film about the easiest day of the year entitled "The Easiest Day of That Particular Year." "You see, the circus exhibition, the great circus exhibition," someone interjected. Yes, snapped Walston. "We all know it was great, but as it was, to date, the only circus exhibition, it could with equal veracity be called the lousy circus exhibition, couldn't it?" The someone had to admit that that was a valid point, although his admission didn't make it into the final film. "The Great Circus Exhibition," began Joni Mitchell's narration over the aerial view of the aforementioned event, "was an immense presentation of artifacts from all the other days of the year laid out in a jumble inside a circus tent 9 miles long. As the camera came down from the dust-filled air at the top of the tent, it focused on 4 young actors covered in symbolic representations of the irresistible inner monologue as they entered the exhibition. Tom Hulse, portraying the Mel Gibson person, remarked to his companions that he had never seen so many bathtubs. Ray, Milton Hershey, in a green body stocking, stepped into one, much to Walston's chagrin. The next bathtub over contained a couple of lily pads. If we would but push them aside, as the camera seemed to do, we would see a mass of buttons and turnips, which indeed were seen by hundreds of nocturnal patrons, many of whom had never set foot in the ocean. Fortunately, there was a line of concession booths selling greasy carnival food and beloved souvenirs, parallel to the exhibition tables, and it was there that Danny, the 4th member of the group, eased into a foot-long hot dog. Hope for the regicides. Duncan reached around to apply a facilitating ointment to his anus and discovered that, since his last inspection, the entire anal area had collapsed into a great bottomless pit. Horrified, he probed the edges with his greasy fingers. The edges seemed dry and relatively hard, unlike any anal area he had ever felt or conjured up in some idle fantasy. The space seemed several inches across and far deeper than he could probe using only his fingers. "My darling," Duncan approached his wife, "I need a hand mirror." "There's one under the bathroom sink," she replied, a little perplexed by the look on her husband's face. She watched him depart and return to mincing cucumbers. As a side note, Kimberly told the class, there actually was a TV show in the early 70s called Mincing Cucumbers. It had nothing to do with cooking or food preparation. Duncan found the mirror. He was distressed that it was a Hello Kitty product that had once belonged to his daughter, and probably still did, technically. Should he write her a letter and ask her if she still wanted it? He lay down on his bed and threw his legs in the air. In the mirror he saw, not a great gaping black hole such as he expected, but "A letter?" Kimberly barked. "Who here has ever written a letter to someone?" She looked around the room at the upraised hands. That's more than I expected. Come on, we're talking a letter here. Not a postcard, not a greeting card, an actual letter in an envelope. A couple of hands fell, but there was still more than Kimberly expected. Okay, how many have written a letter or received one, a personal one, in the last 10 years? Most of the hands fell. That's what I thought. A secret valley wherein a tiny village surrounded a lake. The bulk of our economy is based on things we fish out of the lake, one of the villagers, a heavy metal musician named Dieter, explained to Duncan, who had thrust his head into the hole by a Supreme Effort. Supreme Effort was his band's first album, according to Kimberly. Although revenue from tourists such as yourself is increasing every year, but you haven't spent any money yet, have you? Dieter pointed his flying V accusingly at Duncan. The latter hastened to purchase a hand mirror with a hand-carved wooden handle and frame. It was painted in a colorful traditional design of ducks and horses, neither of which can control their bowel movements, Kimberly added, making what most of the class felt was a feeble connection between the mirror and the anus. Do you have some personal animus against the author? One student asked. No, answered Kimberly. I just wish he'd keep his hands off other people's stuff.